The air in New Orleans doesn't just hang, it presses down on you, thick with the ghosts of last night's rain and the promise of tomorrow's. I could smell it from the staff dressing room, a tiny, breathless space behind the kitchen of the Blue Magnolia. It was a cocktail of Chartres Street pavement, damp and clean, and the sweet, fatty perfume of nutmeg from the beignets they fried over on Decatur. You breathe that air in long enough, it gets into your blood. I leaned closer to the mirror, a flawed piece of glass that warped my reflection just enough to make me feel like a stranger. The lights around it were supposed to be charming, a string of tiny firefly bulbs, but they cast a sick yellow glow, perfect for hiding things. I dipped the sponge into the concealer palette, dabbing the thick, bright paste over the ugly bloom on my cheekbone. It was the color of a dying plum, a deep purple mottling into a sickly yellow at the edges. Brent had a heavy hand. He always said it was an accident. My uniform was a crisp white shirt and black trousers. I kept the collar buttoned to the top, even though the steam from the gumbo pots made the fabric cling to my throat and sweat prickled at my hairline. A flesh-tone bandage was wrapped tight around my left wrist, covering the other, more awkwardly shaped bruise. It was a neat little package of secrets. Eliza Voss, 24 singer of sad songs on Tuesdays and Thursdays, server of Sazeracs the rest of the week, and a very, very good liar. The bell chimed, a soft brassy sound that meant a new customer had arrived. I took one last look. The makeup was holding. The smile was in place. I was ready. The main room of the Blue Magnolia was my stage and my sanctuary. Delphine, the owner, kept it dim and intimate. All dark wood, deep blue velvet, and the glint of polished brass from the saxophones on the bandstand. Smoke, the legal kind these days, curled in the air, catching the low light and making halos around the patrons. I moved through the tables, my tray held high, a ballet of practiced efficiency. Smile, pour, take the order, disappear. Then I saw him. He was at table 9, the one tucked into the corner, half hidden by a potted palm and a reflection in the big, antique mirror that covered the back wall. Delphine had given me the signal earlier, a sharp, subtle tap of her finger to her temple. Important. That was all it meant. In this city, important could mean a city councilman, a visiting movie star, or a man who owned the docks. You treated them all the same with deference and a very steady hand. This man was the third kind. I knew it before I knew anything else. It wasn't just the suit, a beautiful thing made of sand-colored linen that probably cost more than my rent for a year. It wasn't the way his tie was loosened just so, a deliberate note of informality in an otherwise impeccable presentation. It was his stillness. The Blue Magnolia was a place of noise. Clinking glasses, low laughter, the mournful cry of a clarinet, but a pocket of absolute silence surrounded his table. He didn't demand attention. He commanded it by his sheer lack of movement. He just sat there, nursing a glass of amber liquid, and watched the room in the mirror. My phone buzzed in my apron pocket. I didn't need to look. It was Brent. His calls came in threes, rapid fire, an insistent demand for my attention. My heart gave a familiar, sickening lurch. I ignored it, pressing the side of my hip against the bar to muffle the vibration. Sazerac for 9. Antoine, the bartender, said, sliding the heavy crystal glass across the polished wood. The scent of anise and Peychaud's bitters hit me, the official fragrance of New Orleans nightlife. I picked it up. My hand was steady. It had to be. I navigated the tables, the phone buzzing again, a furious little insect against my skin. Brent, don't answer. That's how he was saved in my contacts, a warning to myself. As I approached the table, the man, Ciro Valente, though I wouldn't know his name for another 10 minutes, finally turned his gaze from the mirror to me. His eyes were dark, not black, but a deep, quiet brown that seemed to absorb the light around them. There was no menace in them. No overt threat, just an unnerving level of perception. It felt like he was looking past my skin, past the carefully applied concealer, and straight at the ugly truth beneath. I placed the Sazerac down on the crisp white linen, and that's when my body betrayed me. A tremor, born of exhaustion and the relentless buzzing in my pocket, ran up my arm. My fingers shook, just a little, but it was enough. The ice in the glass rattled, a tiny, shameful sound in the bubble of silence around his table. His eyes flicked down to my hand, then back to my face. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just watched. And in that moment, I felt more exposed than if I'd been standing there naked. He saw it. He saw the whole sordid story. I murmured, "Enjoy your drink, sir," and turned to leave. My face burning. My shift was almost over. I just had to make it through the next hour without falling apart. One more round of drinks, cash out, and then the long walk home, where Brent would be waiting, his temper simmering over 3 unanswered calls. "Waitress?" His voice was low, a soft rumble that cut through the club's noise effortlessly. I stopped, my back still to him. "You dropped this," he said. I turned around. There was nothing on the floor. Then he was holding his hand out, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to point out the tremor, to humiliate me. But his gaze was directed at my tray. In my haste, I'd nearly sent a small dish of olives skittering off the edge. As I reached to steady it, my body moved awkwardly. My sleeve, damp with sweat and condensation, slid up my arm just an inch. It was all it took. The edge of the bandage on my wrist was visible, but worse. So was the cluster of bruises just below it, finger-shaped, a perfect half-moon where a grip had been too tight. Before I could react, before I could pull my sleeve down and run, his hand shot out, not to grab me, but to steady the tray from underneath. His touch was firm, his wrist strong, yet surprisingly gentle. The contact sent a jolt through me, a strange warmth that had nothing to do with fear. "Careful, Bella," he said, his voice still that quiet, intimate murmur. His eyes met mine, and they held a flicker of something I couldn't name. Not pity, something harder. New Orleans is slippery even when it's not raining. He let go, his fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. The tray was steady now. My heart was not. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a business card. Placing it face down on my tray, it was thick, black and matte, the edges sharp and clean. "For your trouble," he said, though I knew it wasn't a tip. I could only nod, my throat tight. As I walked away, my legs feeling like they were moving through water, he added one more thing, his voice barely a whisper, meant only for me. "If you ever need someone to bandage doors that swing shut on their own." I didn't look back. I fled to the relative safety of the kitchen, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I flipped the card over. It read, "Valente and Company, Logistics," in simple, elegant silver lettering. On the back, a single phone number was handwritten in the same clean, silver ink. No name. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I avoided table 9. When my hour was up, I collected my tips. A pitifully small handful of bills Brent would have his cut and said a quick goodnight to Delphine. She just looked at me, her expression worried, and squeezed my shoulder. "You be safe going home, Eliza." I slipped out the back entrance into the narrow, damp alley that ran along Conti Street. The rain had started again, a soft, persistent drizzle that beaded on the metal awning above me and filled the air with the smell of wet garbage and old brick. This was the part of the night I hated most. The alley was always dark, the street lamp at the end casting long, distorted shadows. And tonight, one of those shadows was waiting for me. Brent stood blocking the mouth of the alley, his broad shoulders filling the space. The light behind him turned him into a menacing silhouette. He wasn't alone. 2 other figures flanked him, guys from the boxing gym, both of them built like refrigerators. Cobalt hounds, the low-level crew he ran errands for. This was bad. This wasn't just about the missed calls. "Where you been, Ellie?" Brent's voice was deceptively soft, but it held a ragged edge that I knew all too well. I was worried. I stopped, my back pressing against the cold, wet brick of the club. My small purse felt useless in my hand. "My shift just ended. Brent, you know that." "Yeah, I know that," he said, Taking a step forward, the other two fanned out slightly, cutting off any escape. But you don't answer your phone. Makes a guy think things. Makes him think maybe you're being disrespectful. I was busy. It was loud. The excuses sounded feeble even to me. He was in front of me now, his shadow swallowing me whole. He smelled of stale beer and cheap cologne. Busy, he sneered. I'll show you busy. He reached for me. I flinched, turning my head, bracing for the inevitable. My eyes squeezed shut. I heard the scuff of his shoes on the pavement, the rain pattering on the awning, the frantic thumping of my own blood in my ears. But the blow never came. Instead, there was a new sound, the whisper of tires on wet asphalt, a low, powerful hum that seemed to absorb all other noise. I opened my eyes. A black SUV, sleek and polished and utterly without license plates, had glided to a stop at the end of the alley. It blocked the streetlight completely, its headlights dark. It was just a massive, silent shape in the night. The driver's side door opened, then the passenger side. Two men got out. They moved with the same quiet efficiency as the vehicle, their suits dark, their faces unreadable in the gloom. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They simply walked toward us. Brent and his friends froze, the aggression drained out of them, replaced by a sudden, primal fear. "Who the hell are you?" Brent stammered, taking an involuntary step back. The men didn't answer. They just kept coming. There was no fight and there was no struggle. It was less a confrontation and more of a removal, a problem being taken care of. One of the newcomers made a gesture, a simple flick of the wrist, and Brent's two goons seemed to understand. They raised their hands and backed away, melting back into the shadows they'd come from. That left Brent. He looked from the two silent men to me, his face a mask of confusion and terror. The second man reached him. I didn't see a weapon, I just saw the man's hand close on Brent's shoulder, a grip that made the big boxer wince. A few quiet words were exchanged, too low for me to hear over the rain. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. They turned Brent around and walked him toward the SUV, and he didn't fight back. He stumbled along like a man in a trance. They opened a rear door, pushed him inside, and closed it with a soft, solid thud. The two men got back in the front. The engine hummed. The SUV pulled away from the curb, its tires hissing on the wet street, and disappeared into the New Orleans night. And I was alone in the alley. The rain fell on my face. Mingling with tears, I didn't know I was crying. The only sound was the patter on the tin awning. The only sign that anything had happened was the sudden, ringing silence where Brent used to be. The problem had been taken care of. The door had been bandaged shut. And I stood there, clutching a matte black business card, terrified and, for the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly free. The walk home from the quarter was a blur, a dreamlike passage through streets that were suddenly too quiet, the sound of the rain on the pavement swallowing the echo of my own footsteps. I let myself into my apartment, a small loft space above a closed antique shop, the kind of place with exposed brick and drafty windows that looked romantic until you had to pay the heating bill. I didn't bother with the lights. I walked straight to the tall, arched window that overlooked the river, the great dark curve of the Mississippi cutting the city in two. The lights of Algiers on the other side were misty watercolor smears. I was still clutching the matte black business card. My other hand, the one I'd used to steady the Sazerac, was shaking, but it was a new kind of tremor. It wasn't the rattling vibration of fear, the adrenaline surge that came when Brent raised his voice or his hand. This was the shake of the aftermath. It was the deep, cellular shudder of a structure that has survived an earthquake, the profound vibration of the void where a mountain of terror used to be. The fear was gone, and the emptiness it left behind was hollow and vast, and I was rattling inside it. I finally turned on a small table lamp, its light pooling yellow on the worn wooden floor. I looked at the card, Valente and Company, Logistics. The paper stock was impossibly thick, feeling less like paper and more like tightly woven linen. The kind of material you'd find in a suit jacket that cost 4 figures. The silver lettering was embossed, the edges precise. It was a card that spoke of money and permanence. And on the back, the handwritten number, not just a number, but an answer. A terrifying, final answer. My phone was on the counter. It was silent. For the last year, my phone had been a leash, a proximity mine. It buzzed and chimed relentlessly. Brent's demands for my location, my time, my tips. If I missed a call, it was an interrogation. If I turned it off, it was a declaration of war. Now, it was just a dead piece of glass and plastic. The silence it emitted was louder than any of his shouts had ever been. I unlocked it, my fingers still clumsy. No new messages, no missed calls. I opened my social media, my heart hammering a strange, flat rhythm. I went to his page. Brent lived his life on display. A constant stream of grainy videos from the gym. Blurry shots of his crew, the Cobalt Hounds holding up drinks in dive bars. Motivational quotes misspelled over pictures of lions. His page was just gone. Not set to private, not blocked. The feed was empty. The stories were blank. It was as if he had never existed. The digital footprint of Brent Kincaid had been wiped clean, as efficiently as if someone had taken a cloth to a dusty mirror. Taken care of. What did that mean? The phrase circled in my head, soft and insidious. It wasn't a word like hurt or warned. It was a sterile, corporate word. The kind of language used in logistics. It was the language of problems being solved. I tried to picture it, to give the vague horror a shape. Did those silent, suited men drive him to the parish line and tell him to never come back? Did they put him on a bus to a state I'd never heard of? Or did they deliver him to someone else? Someone he owed money to, someone far more dangerous than he was, someone who wouldn't be satisfied with a punch to the cheek. The ambiguity was a special kind of torture, a gray fog that was perhaps worse than knowing. And then there was Cairo Valente. He rose in my memory, a perfect paradox. He was the only man in that entire club who had looked at me and seen me, not as a waitress, not as a singer, not as an object to be appraised, but as a person who was seconds away from breaking. When he'd steadied my tray, his touch had been a question, not a command. He had watched my sleeve fall, seen the map of my humiliation, and his response hadn't been predatory. It had been respectful. He was the most dangerous man I had ever met, and he was the only one who had ever made me feel safe, even for just a second. That contradiction was a hook, and I could feel it lodging itself deep under my skin. I didn't sleep. I just watched the river flow, dark and relentless. The next day, I went to work. It was the only thing I knew how to do. Walking into the Blue Magnolia felt like walking onto a stage in the middle of a play I hadn't rehearsed. Everything was the same. The smell of stale bourbon and beeswax, the glint of the brass, the low murmur of Antoine setting up the bar. But I was fundamentally different. Delphine caught me before I could even clock in. She was a formidable woman, tall and elegant, who had run this club on her own terms for 20 years. She knew everything that happened in the quarter. She grabbed my arm, her grip strong, and pulled me into her tiny, cluttered office. She didn't ask about Brent. She didn't ask about my bruises, which I had once again hidden under a layer of hopeful concealer. "You served table 9 last night," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Cairo Valente." She said his name, and it hung in the air between us, heavy as a shroud. "Eliza, you listen to me." Her eyes, usually warm and shrewd, were tight with a rare worry. "You don't get involved with those men. You don't get involved with the logistics people." She used the same word he had. "They are gentlemen. They are polite. They open doors and they steady trays. They are the kindest men in New Orleans." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that scared me more than Brent's yelling. "Until they are not, and you never see the not coming." I understand, Delphine," I stammered. "No, you don't," she said, cutting me off. "You're a sweet girl, and you sing like a broken heart. That's a dangerous combination around a man like that. Whatever you think he did for you, it wasn't a gift, it was a purchase, and he will come to collect. Stay away from him." She let me go, and I walked out onto the floor, her words echoing in my head. It was a purchase. That night, the club was slow. The house jazz trio was on the bandstand, running through their sound check. They were playing Do You Know What It Means to Miss New Orleans. The trumpet was muted, the notes long and mournful, full of a deep, aching loneliness. It was a question that seemed to hang in the smoky air, aimed directly at me. I wasn't sure if I missed anything. I just felt the hole in my chest, the space where Brent's heavy, suffocating presence had been. It was a raw, clean wound, and I didn't know what was supposed to grow there in its place. When I had a break, I went back to the staff dressing room, to that same flawed mirror. I looked at myself. Really looked. The bruises were still there. Faint yellow ghosts under the makeup, but the person looking back at me had changed. The apology was gone from my eyes. The constant flinching preparedness to be struck had vanished. My reflection was still. It was the stillness I had seen in Quiro Valente, and in the place of the fear, there was a question. It wasn't what happens next, it was why. Why me? Why did he notice men like him didn't see women like me? And my mind, now clear of the fog of immediate survival, supplied the answer. Brent hadn't just been a physical threat. He was a parasite. He was the reason I was still serving Sazeracs instead of running a soundboard. He'd taken my tip money, siphoning it off for his debts to the Cobalt Hounds. He'd mocked my application to the sound design program at the community college, telling me I was too stupid to learn the tech, that my place was on a stage where men could look at me, not behind a console where I was invisible. He hadn't just been hurting me. He had been actively extinguishing my future. He had been a door swinging shut on its own. I took the black card out of my pocket. I wouldn't call the number. Delphine was right. I would not trade one cage for another. No matter how gilded, I was free of Brent, and I would stay free. But I wasn't a fool. This city was a dangerous place, and I had just seen how quickly its currents could move. I took out my phone. I took a clear, high-resolution picture of the front and back of the card. I created a new contact, left the name field blank, and attached the photo. Then in the company field, I typed a single word. The door. I put my phone away. The night was quiet, settling over the city like a blanket. From my window, I could hear the distant, lonely hoot of a tugboat pushing a barge up the Mississippi, the sound of real logistics. As I watched, a light blinked on across the river. Far down by the industrial docks, a large, bright floodlight illuminated the side of a massive, windowless building. I could just make out the faded logo painted on its side, a blue circle and bold lettering. Esplanade Cold Storage. It meant nothing to me. It was just another warehouse on the water. But the light stayed on, a single, insistent star in the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that a new thread had just been pulled taut. The quiet of my loft lasted exactly 12 hours. The next morning, sunlight was cutting harsh. Dusty lines through the high windows when I walked into the Blue Magnolia for my prep shift. The club felt alien in the daytime, like seeing a stage vampire in a supermarket. The brass was dull, the velvet looked tired, and two men in cheap suits were waiting by the bar, talking to Delphine. She looked tense, her arms crossed tight over her chest. The men looked like they'd dressed in the dark. Their ties were sloppy, their jackets pulling at the shoulders. They were not Ciro Valente. "That's her," Delphine said as I approached, her voice flat. One of the men turned. He had a weary face and eyes that had seen too many late nights. "Eliza Voss." "Yes." He flashed a badge, but it wasn't the familiar gold shield of the NOPD. It was silver, an unfamiliar crest I didn't recognize, with the letters T-Pit embossed on it. "Tri-Parish Integrity Task Force," he said, as if that explained everything. The other guy, younger and jittery, just watched me. his hand resting near his hip. "We have some questions about your boyfriend, Brent Kincaid." The first man said, "When was the last time you saw him?" The air in my lungs went cold and still. This was it, the other side of the solution. I thought of the black card, the door. I thought of Delphine's warning, stay away from him. I looked the T-Pit officer right in the eye. The apologetic, flinching girl who lived in this body yesterday was gone, buried under the pavement in that Conti Street alley. "I don't have a boyfriend," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the Mississippi. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Records show you filed a complaint against a Brent Kincaid 2 months ago. You dropped it." "I made a mistake. I ended things." "When?" "The day after I dropped the complaint." I lied. "I haven't seen him in weeks. Am I in some kind of trouble?" "Oh." "Everyone's in trouble, Miss Voss," the jittery one muttered, earning a sharp look from his partner. "Mister, Kincaid is a person of interest in an ongoing investigation," the first officer said, ignoring his partner. "It's related to a string of predatory debt collections. If you hear from him, you call this number." He handed me a standard-issue white card, a stark contrast to the black linen in my wallet. "I will," I said. They looked around the club, their eyes lingering on the expensive bottles behind the bar, as if the whole place were guilty of something. They didn't seem to know what else to ask. I was a dead end, a closed door. Finally. They nodded curtly at Delphine and left, the cowbell on the front door jangling loudly in the morning quiet. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Eliza," Delphine said, her voice sharp. I turned to her. She looked pale. "In my office now." She didn't wait. I followed her back to the tiny room, the one that smelled of old ledgers and chicory coffee. She shut the door and leaned against it. "You're a terrible liar," she said. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't," she snapped. "I saw your face. Those T-Pit clowns are barking up the wrong tree, but they're sniffing something. The word on the street is that the Marrow Street crew is making a play for the waterfront. They've been using the Cobalt Hounds Brent's little gang of thugs as their collection agency, and his gym as a drop point." My blood ran even colder. This was so much bigger than missed calls and stolen tips. "Brent was in over his head," she continued, her voice low and fast. "Way over, and now he's vanished, and a day later the task force is asking questions. This is not good, Eliza. This is the kind of trouble that doesn't just knock. It burns the whole building down." She gripped my arms. "I don't know what happened in that alley. I don't want to know. But whoever Brent was mixed up with, they're not going to care that you're just a waitress. They're going to see you as a loose end." "What do I do?" I whispered. "You keep your head down, you work your shift, and if anyone comes in here asking for you, anyone who looks like they don't belong, you don't talk, you don't make eye contact, you walk straight to the kitchen, out the back, and you run." Her phone rang, a shrill sound that made both of us jump. She looked at the screen, and her expression went from worried to exhausted. "Yes," she answered. She listened for a long moment, her eyes fixed on me. "Yes, she's here. Tonight, the whole section, of course." She paused again. "I understand. The yellow light. It will be done." She hung up and stared at the phone. "That was Kiro Valenti," she said, though I already knew. My heart was doing a slow, heavy drum roll against my ribs. "He didn't call for me," I said, almost a question. "No," Delphine said, her voice laced with a new kind of irony. "He called for me. He booked the entire banquet section, table 9 and the 2 on either side of it, 6 p.m. until close." She let out a dry laugh. "And he requested that you be the only one to serve them, said you understood the clientele. And he specifically requested I put a yellow bulb in the lamp over table 9. I didn't understand. "A yellow bulb." "It's an old theater trick," she said, looking at me with something approaching pity. "It's the most flattering light. It makes everyone look warm. It hides flaws, blemishes, bruises." That night, I felt like I was walking onto a different kind of stage. The blue magnolia was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The yellow light over table 9 created a small, golden island in the smoky blue of the club. I was terrified, but beneath the fear, there was something else. A strange, sharp curiosity. At 6 o'clock on the dot, he arrived. Cairo Valente moved like he had in my memory a column of absolute stillness in the center of the club's chaos. But tonight, he was not alone. Flanking him were two people who looked like they'd been carved from different stones. The man was older, in his 50s, with a magnificent head of salt and pepper hair brushed back from his temples. He wore a gray suit that was even finer than Cairo's, and he carried a thin, leather-bound portfolio. He looked like a university professor or a high-priced attorney, and his eyes, as they scanned the room, missed nothing. The woman was my age, maybe a little older. She was dressed simply, in black trousers and a silk blouse. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, held in place by a single, long, ornamental pin. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and utterly devoid of expression. The only remarkable thing about her was the tattoo visible on the inside of her right wrist as she adjusted her cuff, a complex, antique compass rose. Cairo took his usual seat at table 9, the one that watched the room in the mirror, the lawyer. Armand Bell sat opposite him. Opening his portfolio, the woman, Lenny Quell, took the end seat, the one that faced the front door. I approached, my tray held steady. Delphine's warning was screaming in my head. It was a purchase. "Good evening, gentlemen, ma'am," I said. Armand Bell gave me a polite, academic nod. Lenny Quell's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, cold and assessing, like a camera taking a snapshot. Cairo looked up at me. The yellow light was indeed flattering. It softened the hard lines of his face and warmed his dark eyes. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease. He didn't look at my face, at the fading bruise. He didn't ask if I was all right. He didn't mention the alley or Brent or the tea pit. "Eliza," he said, his voice that same low rumble, "you sing tonight." "Yes, sir, the 9:30 set." "Good." He leaned back. "I have a request. St. James Infirmary." I blinked. It was one of the darkest songs in the repertoire, a slow, agonizing blues ballad about loss and regret. Of course. "Your voice suits the shadows," he said. As if that were the highest compliment, he turned to Armand, and just like that, I was dismissed. At 9:30, I was on the bandstand. The light was hot. The microphone was cool in my hand. I could see their table, a golden tableau in the darkness. Cairo, listening. Armand reading his documents. Lenny watching the door. I sang St. James Infirmary. I poured every ounce of the last 48 hours into it. The fear, the void, the strange, cold relief. I sang for the death of the girl I had been. When I finished, there was a beat of stunned silence before the applause rolled in. Cairo didn't clap. He just raised his glass to me. A single, slow gesture. I went back to serving. As I was delivering a round of drinks, I saw them, 2 men, standing by the bar, near the entrance. They were the wrong shape for the club. They wore leather jackets. Their necks were thick, and they weren't trying to blend in. They were looking right at me. Cobalt hounds, Brent's friends. My stomach turned to ice. I saw Lenny Quell see them. Her hand, which had been resting on the table, moved slowly, deliberately, up to the ornamental pin in her hair. Her fingers brushed it, a light, testing touch. A sliver of polished steel glinted where the pin entered the knot of her hair. It wasn't an accessory, it was a tool. Cairo continued his conversation with Armand, not looking up, as if he hadn't a care in the world, but I saw his eyes in the mirror. He was watching the reflection of the men at the door. I tried to follow Delphine's advice, head down, to the kitchen, run. But I was paralyzed, my tray held in a white-knuckled grip. As I turned to retreat, a drunk at the table next to mine, a tourist in a loud shirt, reached out and grabbed my arm. "Hey, sweet thing, sing that sad one again." His hand closed exactly on the bandage covering my wrist. I flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk, spilling bourbon onto my tray. Before the drunk could even blink, Ciro Valente was on his feet. He hadn't moved quickly, but it felt like he had teleported. 1 second he was at his table, the next he was standing over the tourist, casting a shadow that swallowed him whole. The entire club, the chatter, the music, the clinking of glasses, it all seemed to drop away, sucked into the vacuum of his presence. Cairo didn't touch the man. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked down at him. "You will apologize to the lady," he said. It was not a request. The tourist, his face pale and suddenly sober, stammered, I didn't mean..." "Apologize to her." "I'm sorry," the man said, looking at me, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm sorry, Miss..." Cairo held his gaze for 1 second longer. Then he turned to me, his expression softening just enough for me to see. He nodded once, giving me permission to leave. He sat back down. Armand Bell hadn't even looked up from his papers. Lenny's hand was no longer in her hair. The 2 men in leather jackets were gone from the doorway. The spell broke. The noise of the club rushed back in. I fled to the kitchen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would break a rib. At the end of the night, after Cairo and his quiet associates had left, I went to my locker. It was empty except for my purse and a plain white envelope. My name wasn't on it. I tore it open. Inside was a thick stack of cash, hundreds. It was more than I'd made in a month of tips. Tucked into the fold was a small, square note, the same thick stock as his business card. 4 words were written in clean, silver ink. "Your money is your own." I stared at it, the paper shaking in my hand. He knew. He knew Brent had been taking my tips. He knew about the community college application. This wasn't a gift. It wasn't a purchase. It was an investment. He was clearing my debts, real and imagined. I left the club just after 2 stepping out into the damp, cool air. The Conti Street alley was empty, the shadows clean. I walked fast, my keys clutched in my fist. As I turned onto Royal, I heard it, the low growl of an engine. Too slow. A battered pickup truck, its headlights off, was pacing me from across the street. I crossed to the other side. The truck crossed, too. I started to walk faster, my blood turning to slush. This was them. Marrow Street or the Hounds, here to collect the loose end. I was a block from my apartment. I debated screaming, running. Then, from a side street I hadn't even noticed, a dark sedan slid out, its engine as quiet as the SUV that had taken Brent. It didn't speed, it just inserted itself between me and the pickup truck, blocking the street. The truck slammed on its brakes, its tires squealing. I saw Lenny Quell in the driver's seat of the sedan. She turned and looked at the truck, her face illuminated by her dashboard lights. She didn't wave, she didn't move, she just stared. I didn't wait to see the outcome. I ran. I bolted from my apartment door, fumbled with the key, and threw myself inside, locking the deadbolt behind me. I raced up the stairs to my window. Down on the street, the sedan was gone, the pickup truck was gone, the entire street was empty, as if nothing had ever happened. It was all clean, silent, and efficient. I was being protected. I was being watched. I was Cairo Valente's. 2 nights later, the air was so thick you could drink it. After my last set, I bypassed the stuffy dressing room and slipped out onto the small, wrought iron balcony that hung off the 2nd floor of the club, overlooking the Conti Street alley. Down here, the city's perfume was a potent brew, the sweet, almost funereal scent of the magnolia tree in the courtyard, the damp decay of old brick, and the lingering ghost of yesterday's rain. The wood of the railing was soft and slightly rotten under my palms, a familiar texture. This was my spot, the place I came to breathe when the smoke and the stories inside became too much. I heard the creak of the French door behind me and knew, without turning, who it was. He moved with a distinct lack of sound, a quiet that was more profound than silence itself. I felt his presence displace the heavy air. Ciro Valente stopped a full step away from me, leaving a deliberate, respectful space between us. He wasn't crowding me, wasn't using his size to intimidate. He was giving me the choice of distance, a courtesy so foreign it felt like a language I'd never heard spoken. He leaned against the railing, his gaze not on me, but down into the shadowed alley where my life had irrevocably fractured and reset itself. "I had Armand look into the community college," he said, his voice a low counterpoint to the distant wail of a saxophone from somewhere on Bourbon Street. "The sound design program? Your application was incomplete, the financial aid forms were never submitted." I stared down at my hands, at the knuckles that were no longer bruised. It's hard to save money when your wallet has a hole in it. The words were bitter, but they came out steady. "The hole has been patched," he said simply. We stood in that charged silence for a long time, listening to the city breathe. I could feel the question hanging between us, the one that had nothing to do with college or money. It was about what happened next, about what his intervention, his protection truly meant. He finally turned his head, and in the dim glow from the club's windows, I saw the seriousness in his eyes. "I will not touch you, Eliza," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Not unless you nod." A strange, watery laugh escaped my lips. It was a brittle sound. That's the first time anyone has ever asked for my consent like they're asking for a song request. A flicker of something pain, maybe, or memory crossed his face. It was gone as quickly as it came. "My mother," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "spent 10 years married to a man with heavy hands. She ran with nothing but me and the clothes on her back. I learned early what a hand is for, and what it is not for." He looked at his own hands, resting on the railing. They were strong, capable. The kind of hands that could steady a tray or sign a death warrant. I have a deep dislike for hands that are used for taking. His admission settled into the space between us, warming it, chasing away some of the night's chill. He wasn't just a powerful man flexing his muscle. He was a boy who remembered his mother's fear. He was a man who saw that same fear in my eyes and hated it on a personal, fundamental level. It was a purchase, Delphine had said. But this didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like an allegiance. A sudden breeze, cool and damp from the river, swirled up the alley. It caught a loose strand of my hair, whipping it across my cheek, sharp and sudden like a tiny sting. I reached up to push it away, but his hand was there first. He moved slowly, with an almost agonizing grace. His fingers didn't touch my skin. He simply caught the strand of hair, his touch as light as a moth's wing, and tucked it gently behind my ear. His hand hovered there for a moment, a breath away from my face, giving me all the time in the world to pull back, to flinch, to say no. I held his gaze, and in that shared look, I gave him my answer. I nodded. He closed the distance between us, but the deliberation didn't stop. This wasn't a man driven by sudden passion. This was a man acting on a considered decision. His shoulder brushed against mine, a soft, solid point of contact. His hand, the one that had just tamed my hair, slid down to cup the back of my neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin there. A silent question. I leaned into the touch. A silent answer. He didn't crush his mouth to mine. It wasn't a kiss of possession or of conquest. It began with our hands. He brought his free hand up to meet mine, our palms pressing together, fingers slowly, tentatively intertwining. It was an introduction, a formal greeting between two people who had already seen the ugliest parts of each other's worlds. Only then did he lean in. His breath was warm, and it smelled of the Sazerac he always drank, bitter orange and something clean, like anise, mingled with the faint, sweet scent of the powdered sugar that perpetually dusted the French Quarter air. He waited, his lips a whisper away from mine, his eyes asking one final time. I closed my eyes and tilted my head up, and our lips finally met. The kiss was soft, searching. It was a conversation without words. There was no desperate, bruising force, none of the selfish taking I had been conditioned to expect. It was a slow discovery, a mapping of textures and temperatures. His lips were firm, gentle. It was a kiss that offered comfort before it asked for passion. I felt a knot in my chest, a tight, painful thing I had been carrying for years, begin to unravel. My hand, the one not laced in his, came up to rest on his chest, over the fine linen of his suit. I felt the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath my palm. It was calm, unhurried. He deepened the kiss then, a subtle shift from a question to a statement, but it was a statement of mutual feeling, not of ownership. We weren't in a bedroom. We were on a rickety balcony, leaning against the cool, rough brick of a century-old building, the sounds of the city swirling around us. My shirt was still buttoned, his suit jacket still in place, but in the way our fingers were locked together, in the way my body sagged against his with a trust I hadn't known I possessed. It was more intimate than any act I had ever known. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. The air between us felt charged, electric. I looked up at him, at this man who was a walking contradiction, a violent peace, a dangerous sanctuary. I needed him to understand. I needed to say the words out loud, for my own sake. I took a small half-step back, creating a sliver of space, reclaiming my own ground. I am not a prize to be won, I said, my voice quiet but firm. His expression didn't change. There was no offense, no anger, only a deep, abiding understanding. You are not the war, he replied, his voice a gravelly promise. The meaning hit me with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't fighting over me. He wasn't trying to win me from Brent or anyone else. He was fighting the war itself, the fear, the violence, the hands used for taking. I wasn't the territory, I was his ally. From the club below, the jazz trio swung into a lively, upbeat number. The sudden burst of joyous music was so at odds with the intensity of the moment that we both broke into small, quiet laughter. The tension was broken, replaced by something lighter, something that felt impossibly like hope. Tomorrow, he said, his thumb stroking the back of my hand, breakfast. At Café du Monde, we'll get powdered sugar all over our clothes. He paused, his eyes holding mine. No Armand, no Lenny, just beignets. It was an invitation into a different world, a normal world, a world where a man and a woman could just have breakfast. Okay, I whispered, just beignets. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then released my hand and with a final, almost imperceptible nod, he turned and walked back through the French doors, disappearing into the noise and smoke of the club. I stayed on the balcony for a few minutes more, my fingers pressed to my lips, the ghost of his kiss still warm on my skin. When I finally turned to leave, I saw him exit the club's main entrance below and walk down the street, alone. As he passed under a streetlight, another figure detached itself from the shadows of a deep doorway across the street. The figure was a dark, indistinct shape, moving quickly, crossing the alley a half-block behind Cairo. What I couldn't see, what no one could see in the humid New Orleans night, was the faint, ghostly white eye of a thermal imaging camera, mounted high on a rooftop 2 blocks away. In a dark van filled with electronic equipment, an agent of the South Shore Anti-Mob Commission zoomed in, capturing the silent, heat-white image of Cairo Valente turning a corner, and the second, fainter, heat signature of the shadow following him. A new, more dangerous circle was being drawn, and we were standing right in the center of it. The breakfast at Café du Monde was a pocket of impossible normalcy, a scene from a life I'd only ever watched from a distance. The morning air was cool and sweet, and we sat at one of the small green tables, our knees almost touching. Cairo wore a simple gray t-shirt that made him look younger, less like a proprietor of secrets and more like a man enjoying a day off. We were covered in a fine blizzard of powdered sugar within minutes, and he laughed, a rare, genuine sound, as I tried to blow a drift of it off his sleeve, only making it worse. We didn't talk about Brent, or the alley, or the men who followed me home. We talked about music, and the way the humidity makes a guitar's strings go flat, and his grandfather, a tailor from Palermo who believed you could judge a man's character by the knot in his tie. For an hour, we were just a man and a woman sharing beignets, and it felt more dangerous and more real than any kiss. The peace shattered when I got home. An email was waiting for me. The subject line, formal and intimidating, Gulf Coast Arts Fellowship, interview invitation. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had submitted a portfolio months ago, a collection of amateur demos I'd recorded on a borrowed laptop, and had given up hope. Now, here it was, an invitation to interview for a full scholarship, a real path out. My joy lasted for about 30 seconds before a cold suspicion washed it away. I hadn't listed any references. I had barely finished the application. Who had championed me? Who had pushed my name to the top of the pile? I thought of Cairo's words on the balcony. I had Armand look into the community college. Before I could process the implications, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. There was no text, just a video file. I hesitated, a cold dread coiling in my stomach. I pressed play. It was old footage from my old apartment, the one I'd shared with Brent. The camera was shaky. Clearly from his phone, it showed me, my face tear-streaked and furious, shouting at him, "You can't just take it. It's mine. Brent, I earned it." I was yelling about my tip money, about him taking it to pay off some debt, but without that context, I just looked unhinged, a shrew, a screaming, unstable woman. The video cut off. A moment later, a text message appeared below it. "The fellowship board would love to see this. Proof of your character. Unless you want to make a withdrawal from your application and from your new friend's bank account." The air left my lungs. Brent wasn't just gone. He was a ghost with a data plan, reaching out from whatever digital purgatory Cairo had sent him to. This was his weapon, not his fists, but my own voice, my own pain, twisted into a tool to ruin me. I felt the walls of my loft closing in. I did the one thing I had promised myself I wouldn't do. I found the contact saved as the door, and I called the number. He answered on the first ring. "Eliza." He didn't sound surprised. "He contacted me," I said, my voice thin and reedy. "Brent, he has a video. He's going to send it to the fellowship." "I know," Cairo said. There was no alarm in his voice, only a flat, cold calm. "Armand is already handling it." "Handling it? How do you handle something like that? Do you send Lenny?" The question was a whisper. "Lenny is a scalpel, not a hammer," he said. "Her talents are being used elsewhere. She's currently hanging a new coat in the Cobalt Hound's digital closet. Shall we say, a little Trojan horse to see what they're hiding? No. For Brent, we use a different tool. We build a wall of paper." He met me an hour later, not at the club, but in a small, quiet park by the cathedral. Armand was with him, the silver-haired lawyer looking completely at ease on a park bench, his leather portfolio open on his lap. "Mr. Kincaid is a desperate man," Armand said, his voice the calm, measured tone of a lecturer, "and desperate men make mistakes. Our information suggests he's being squeezed by the Marrow Street crew. They believe he's an anchor, that he's holding a phone with encrypted data on all their debtors. They want it. He's stalling, trying to use you as leverage to get cash." "So you're going to pay him?" I asked, horrified. "Absolutely not," Cairo said, his eyes fixed on a group of pigeons pecking at the flagstones. "Paying him would validate his power. We are going to dismantle it." Armand tapped a neatly organized stack of documents. "Mr. Kincaid's gym is financed through a series of small business loans, all co-signed by shell corporations that, if you trace them back far enough, are controlled by Marrow Street. We are, through a third party, entirely clean acquisitions company, purchasing that debt, all of it. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Brent Kincaid no longer owes money to his dangerous friends. He owes it to a legitimate financial entity that will enforce its contracts to the letter of the law. We will freeze his accounts. We will audit his books. We will bury him in legal filings." I stared at them. This was what he meant by a paper wall. It was bloodless, legal, and utterly ruthless. At the same time, Armand continued, we've received word through a discreet source at the Bayou Financial Crimes Directorate that there is a leak within the T-pit. Someone on the inside has been selling raid schedules to Marrow Street, which is why they always seem to be one step ahead. It makes the task force unreliable. As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Delphine. Her voice was shaking. Eliza, you need to see this. I met her at the club's back entrance. She was holding a plain manila envelope. Inside was a single photograph of the blue magnolia and a book of matches from a cheap hotel. Scrawled on the back of the photo were 5 words. If the songbird sings, it burns. I felt sick. This wasn't just about me anymore. They were threatening Delphine, threatening my home. It was in that moment, standing in the alley with the threat in my hand and Armand's words in my ear, that I finally understood. When Cairo had Brent taken care of, he hadn't ordered a simple, brutal execution. That would have been too easy, too messy. It would have made Brent a martyr to his crew. Instead, Cairo had performed a careful, systematic vivisection. He had stripped Brent of his allies, his money and his power. He had isolated him, leaving him with nothing but a grainy video and a dwindling clock. He hadn't just removed the man. He had surgically deconstructed the threat. Piece by painstaking piece. It wasn't about burying a body. It was about erasing a life. The next day, the T-pit called me. The weary-faced officer from before. He was polite. He asked if I would be willing to come in and provide a confidential statement about Brent's activities, his threats, his connections. He said it would be off the record, to help them build their larger case. I told him I'd think about it. Then I called Armand. The choice is yours. Eliza, he said, his voice devoid of any pressure. But my advice is this. Only say what you are prepared to live with the consequences of, and never trust a promise of off the record from a house with a leaky roof. I understood. Testifying could put me in the crosshairs of both the law and the Marrow Street crew. Staying silent meant letting them continue to threaten Delphine. When I told Delphine about the call and about the threat, she didn't flinch. A hard, defiant light came into her eyes. So they want to play with fire, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Fine, let's give them a bonfire. That's how No Bruises, Only Brass was born. Delphine decided we wouldn't hide. We would throw a charity night at the club, a big public event. All proceeds would go to a local shelter for women fleeing domestic violence. I would be the headline performer. We would invite the press, the city council, every person of note she could reach. We would turn their whispered threat into a shout, right in the middle of a brightly lit room. We would fight their shadows with a spotlight. The night before the event, a package was delivered to my apartment. It was a long, slender box wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet, was a microphone. It was a beautiful vintage ribbon mic, the kind with a polished chrome grill and a heavy, solid bass, the type Billie Holiday might have used. It was an icon. Tucked beneath it was a small, square card, the same thick and a black stock as the first one he'd given me. The silver ink was unmistakable. It wasn't a threat, or a promise, or a contract. It was a benediction. For the voice that no longer apologizes, the days leading up to the No Bruises, Only Brass event were a strange symphony of slow-burn intimacy and fast-paced tension. The quiet moments with Cairo felt stolen, precious pockets of calm in the middle of a brewing storm. We didn't have another public breakfast. Instead, our conversations happened in stolen minutes in the quiet of Delphine's office after the club had closed, or in the back of his car as he drove me home. Lenny, a silent, watchful presence in the front seat. It was in those moments that the rest of the world fell away, and we exchanged pieces of ourselves like currency. He told me about his grandfather, the tailor, not just about tying a tie, but about how the old man could read a person's life in the fray of their cuffs and the shine on their lapels. He said his grandfather taught him that a well-made suit was armor. but a man's word was his spine. In return, I found myself telling him things I'd never told anyone. I told him about the first time I ever stood in front of a real microphone at a high school talent show, how my knees had knocked together so hard I was sure the audience could hear it, and how I'd forgotten the first 2 lines of the song. I told him how I'd almost run off the stage, but then I'd found a single, kind face in the crowd, a teacher, and sang the rest of the song just to her. I explained how I'd learned to survive on stage, not with bravado, but with a thin, brittle smile that kept the terror at bay. "You don't have to smile like that anymore," he said, his voice soft, as we sat in his idling car outside my apartment. We'd taken to holding hands during these conversations. It was an unconscious gesture now, a natural point of contact. His hand was large and warm around mine, and the strange, silver ring he wore, shaped like the delicate skeleton of a fish, would press against the back of my hand. It felt less like a piece of jewelry and more like a symbol, a silent commitment to navigating these dark, deep waters together. The first wave of the counterattack came not as a bang, but as a bureaucratic whimper. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Delphine called me, her voice tight with fury. "They're here," she said, "the South Shore Anti-Mob Commission. A surprise inspection of our liquor license. They're pulling bottles off the shelves, checking inventory against invoices from 5 years ago. This is harassment, pure and simple." They were hitting the wrong target to send a message to the right one. They couldn't touch Cairo, so they were trying to break his... What was I, his project? His ally? It didn't matter. They were hurting Delphine to get to me, to get to him. I called Cairo. He listened without interruption as I relayed Delphine's frantic report. "It's a classic move," he said when I was done, his voice betraying no emotion. "They want us scared. They want us to cancel the event to show that pressure works." He paused. "We won't be canceling. We'll be moving." "Moving where?" "Someplace public," he said. "Someplace with too many eyes. The Willow Street Pier. I'll have Armand file for the permits. We'll build our own stage. We'll turn their bonfire into a beacon." It was a brilliant move, turning their threat on its head. A fire is only scary in a dark, enclosed space, out in the open, under the wide New Orleans sky. It's just a light. The next attack was more direct. I was at home, looking over the sheet music for the song I'd written, "No More Closed Doors." When my phone rang, the number was blocked. A cold premonition slid down my spine. I answered, putting it on speaker and hitting record, just as Armand had advised. The voice was distorted, a low, buzzing digital growl, but the cadence, the sneering rhythm of the words, was pure Brent. "I heard you're a big star now, Ellie," the voice buzzed. "Singing for charity, very noble, but your new boyfriend can't protect you from everything. That little video of you. It's just a trailer. I've got the director's cut." "What do you want, Brent?" I asked, proud of how steady my voice sounded. $50,000, Mer, he snarled. "Cash. You bring it to the Esplanade cold storage warehouse. Friday night, midnight, you come alone, or the whole world gets to see what a crazy bitch you really are." He hung up. The silence in my loft was absolute. The bait was laid. The trap was set. The old me would have been hysterical, terrified, trying to figure out how to get the money. The new me simply saved the recording and sent it to Cairo. His reply came a minute later. "Do not engage. Let me speak to him in the language he truly understands, not the language of fists, but of ledgers." The day of the charity event, Lenny Quell came to my apartment. It was the first time we'd been alone together. She was just as severe and silent as she'd been in the club, but in the bright light of my loft, I could see the intelligence that burned behind her stoic expression. She didn't come with a weapon. She came with a map. She unrolled a large, detailed satellite image of the Willow Street Pier and the surrounding blocks onto my kitchen table. It was covered in colored lines and symbols. "This is a shadow map," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "A map of how to be a ghost." She pointed with a long, elegant finger. "The green lines are primary escape routes. Clear lines of sight, multiple exits. The yellow are secondary, slower, more cover. The red X's are dead zones. No exit, poor lighting, blind corners. You never go into a red X. She then pointed to a series of blue circles. These are city cameras. We know which ones are active, which are decoys, and they're fields of vision. You stay out of the blue cones. For an hour, she walked me through it. She showed me the timing of the traffic lights, the location of storm drains, the weakest points in the perimeter fencing. It was a ballet of urban warfare, a choreography of survival. I, who had only ever learned harmonies and chord progressions, was now learning the rhythm of evasion, the counter melody to a threat. I was learning to be Lenny's duet partner, to sing the second part of a song about staying alive. That night, hours before the event was set to begin, I found myself on the balcony of the Blue Magnolia one last time. It felt like saying goodbye to an old friend. The air was cool, the scent of magnolias heavy. Cairo found me there, just as he had before. He came and stood beside me, our shoulders brushing, a familiar, comforting weight. We watched the last of the evening light fade from the sky, the clouds turning a bruised purple. "Are you scared?" he asked quietly. "No," I said, and I was surprised to find it was the truth. I'm ready." I turned to face him. The silence between us was different this time. It wasn't charged with the discovery of a first kiss. It was deeper, calmer, an understanding that had been forged in shared strategy and whispered confessions. He had armed me with microphones and maps. He had shown me how to fight with light and with paper. I was the one who moved first. I raised my hand and placed it flat on his chest, right over his heart. The steady, slow rhythm from before was there, a reassuring beat beneath the fine fabric of his shirt. I looked up into his eyes, and I didn't wait for him to ask. I didn't wait for a nod. I stood on my toes and drew him down to me. The kiss was a confirmation. It was deeper than the first one, more certain. There was no hesitation, no searching. It was a kiss that said, "I am here. I choose this. I am not afraid." His arms came around me, pulling me flush against him. One hand splayed across the small of my back, the other tangled in my hair. His suit jacket, a beautiful dark wool, slid from his shoulders and fell onto a nearby chair with a soft whisper of fabric. My back was against the cool, familiar wood of the balcony door. Every point of contact was a verse in a poem about trust. His warm breath, the searching pressure of his lips, the way his fingers traced the line of my collarbone, a delicate, reverent touch. It was intense, a rising tide of feeling that threatened to pull us both under. It would have been so easy to let the night and the danger and the emotion carry us away. But just as the heat began to build into a fire, he eased back. He rested his forehead against mine, his breathing as ragged as my own. His eyes, when they opened, were dark and heavy with a desire he was deliberately holding in check. We stood there for a long moment, catching our breath, a small, shared laugh escaping our lips. It was a laugh of relief, of acknowledgement, of a line reached, but not crossed. He tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his touch impossibly gentle. "When you want to continue," he whispered, his voice thick. "You tell me. It doesn't have to be tonight." He smiled, a slow, sad, beautiful smile. "I have all the other nights." The legal chessboard, Cairo's paper war, was set in motion, and the pieces began to move with a speed that left me breathless. The day after the Willow Street Pier was announced as the new venue, the South Shore Anti-Mob Commission vanished from Delphine's life. They didn't just suspend their inspection, they evaporated. I found out why in Armand Bell's office. I had never been to his firm. It was on Poydras Street in a high-rise tower of smoked glass and steel that hummed with the silent, refrigerated air of serious money. The office smelled of old leather, lemon oil, and the dry, papery scent of contracts. Cairo was there, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city spread out like a map. He looked as out of place and as perfectly comfortable as a panther in a boardroom. The SAMC backed off, Eliza, because they received a very polite, very detailed letter from us, Armand said, sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. He steepled his fingers. It outlined our intent to file a civil suit against the commission itself and 3 of its ranking officers for state-level harassment and commercial interference. We attached affidavits from 3 other businesses they've inspected in the last year, all of whom, coincidentally, have ties to Cairo's competitors. He smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. It seems they don't appreciate having their own tactics used against them. This was the language of his war, not fists, but filings. But the paper wall has more than one layer, Armand continued. He slid a thin file across the desk. Thanks to Miss Quell's digital exploration, we found the leak at T-Pit, a Detective Miller. He's been on the Marrow Street crew's payroll for a year. He was Brent's coordinator, feeding him information, promising him protection, and selling the T-Pit's raid schedules to Marrow Street. So you're, reporting him, I asked. Reporting him would be messy, Cairo said, his voice quiet, his back still to me. It would start an internal investigation that would be buried in committee. No, we are trading him. Armand nodded. Which brings us to you, Eliza. The law requires its own sacrifices. The district attorney's office, the real one, the lakefront prosecutor's office. Not the T-Pit wants a statement from you. They are building a case, and they need a credible victim. An hour later, I was in a different sterile room, this one downtown. Armand was with me, acting as my counsel. A sharp-eyed prosecutor named O'Connell, a woman who looked like she ran on caffeine and impatience, sat across from me, a digital recorder on the table. Miss Voss, she said, we are not interested in rumors. We are not interested in Mr. Valente. She said his name with a careful neutrality. We are interested in Brent Kincaid. I want you to tell me, for this recording, every threat he has made against you, financial or physical. I want to know about the video. I want to know about the extortion. And so I talked. I played the recording of Brent's ransom call. I described the video, the threats against my fellowship. I spoke only of what he had done to me. A tight, factual narrative of coercion and fear. I never mentioned the alley. I never mentioned the black SUV. I never mentioned Cairo. I was, as far as this room was concerned, simply a woman being blackmailed by a violent ex-boyfriend. When I was done, O'Connell switched off the recorder. Thank you, Miss Voss, she said. Your statement gives us the leverage we need. The leverage was part of the final, suffocating squeeze. Brent was now being attacked from every possible angle. Armand's paper wall had become a shrinking prison. The shell company that held the debt on his gym had frozen his accounts. The city, acting on a series of anonymous complaints, had shut his gym down for 3 separate safety code violations in a single week. His clients, the few who were left, had scattered. He was broke. He was toxic. And he was alone. He's officially oxygen-starved. Cairo told me that evening. We were at the pier, watching the stage crew set up the lights. And now, the Marrow Street crew is calling in their debt. They are done waiting. They believe he still has the encrypted data. They've given him a final deadline tonight. He's to meet them at the Esplanade Cold Storage, the key for his life. But he doesn't have the key, I said, remembering Lenny's work. No, he doesn't, Cairo agreed. Lenny made a copy before she wiped the original. He has nothing to trade. He's a dead man. But Armand had one last card to play. Desperate men sometimes see reason, he said. He was on his phone, pacing the edge of the pier. I'm speaking with our contacts at the Bayou Financial Crimes Directorate. We are offering Brent Kincaid an exit. I stared at him. You're helping him? We are using him, Armand corrected. The BFCD wants the Marrow Street crew more than they want one broken-down boxer. We are offering a trade. Brent hands over his testimony against Detective Miller the T-Pit leak, and in exchange, the Lakefront Prosecutor's Office will offer him full witness protection for his testimony against Marrow Street. He walks away, disappears into the federal system, and we get a clean house. It was a staggering move, a complete solution. They were using Brent to take down both the corrupt cop and the rival crew, all with a single legal maneuver. Cairo looked at Armand, his eyes hard in the setting sun. "On one condition," he said, his voice non-negotiable. "Delphine's name and the name of the Blue Magnolia are never entered into evidence. They are never mentioned in a single report. New Orleans has rules. The club is neutral ground. It is protected. That is the price for our cooperation." Armand relayed the terms. After a moment of silence, he nodded. "The BFCD agrees. The deal is on the table. They are contacting Brent's last known lawyer now." While the men played their game of high-stakes chess, Delphine and I were fighting with our own weapons. She had turned the no bruises, only brass event into a media circus. She'd given an exclusive interview to the Bayou Beacon, the city's main independent paper. The story was a masterpiece, painting me as a local artist taking a stand, and Delphine as the matriarch protecting her community. The threats against the club were framed as cowardly acts against women in charity. The cameras were no longer just a shield, they were a sword. "Let them come," Delphine said, her eyes bright as she watched the local news vans pull up to the pier. "Let them try to start a fire when they're on the 6 o'clock news." Lenny, ever practical, was focused on the what if. She walked me through the escape plan one last time. Her shadow map had become a simple 3-beat rhythm. "Stage left," she said, her voice a low, urgent hum under the noise of the sound check. She pointed to a gap in the scaffolding. 2 steps to the barrier. You vault it. You're on the pier, 20 paces, straight line to the sound van. She pointed to a large black equipment van parked just behind the stage. "It's armored. The side door will be open. I will be inside. You don't stop. You don't look back. You don't wait for Cairo. Stage to pier to van. That is your escape route. Do you understand?" "Stage to pier to van," I repeated, my heart thumping in time with the kick drum. The sun was bleeding into the Mississippi, staining the water a deep, bruised purple. The stage lights flickered on, casting a harsh, bright circle in the twilight. Everything was ready. The net was set. Brent had his one and only exit testify and disappear. Armand's phone rang. The music from the stage died as the sound engineer took a break. The sudden silence was deafening. Armand listened, his face, usually so composed, draining of all color. He lowered the phone slowly. "He refused the deal," he said, his voice barely a whisper. A cold, sick dread washed over me. Cairo, who had been watching the crowd gather, turned to me, his eyes dark with a terrible, sudden clarity. "He's not taking the exit," Cairo said, his voice flat. "He's not going to Esplanade to die. He's not going to the BFCD to live." I looked at the stage, at the bright, empty circle of light where I was supposed to stand, at the news cameras aimed right at it, and I knew. "He's coming here," I whispered. Cairo nodded, his jaw tight. "He's lost everything. The gym, the money, his crew. He's a cornered animal, and he thinks you're the one who cornered him. He has nothing left to lose. He's no longer a problem to be managed." He looked at the stage, and then at me. "He's a bomb, and he's aiming for the spotlight." The trumpet note was a silver thread, cutting through the thick, humid air off the river. It hung there for a beat, lonely and mournful, before the upright bass kicked in, a rhythm like a slow, steady heartbeat. That was my cue. I walked out onto the temporary stage, my heels clicking on the rough plywood. The vintage microphone Cairo had sent me was heavy and cool in my hand, a solid anchor in a swirling sea of adrenaline. The hot white lights hit me, blinding me to the crowd beyond the first few rows. I looked down at my left wrist. The skin was bare, pale, with the faintest yellow shadow of a healing bruise, but it was my own. I hadn't covered it. My dress was navy blue, almost black in the shadows, simple and severe. I felt utterly exposed, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't afraid of it. I scanned the periphery. It wasn't in the front row, not playing the part of the benefactor. It was exactly where he said he would be, at the edge of the light, half hidden by a stack of amplifiers, a silent silhouette against the dark water. He wasn't watching me. He was watching the crowd, his gaze sweeping the perimeter. He was giving me the stage, but he was guarding its borders. He saw me find him, and his head gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. Breathe. Sing. I turned back to the mic. The bass line thrummed through the soles of my shoes. I opened my mouth and sang the song I had written in my drafty loft, No More Closed Doors. My voice trembled on the first note, then it caught. Locking in with the music, I poured everything into it, the fear, the rage, the impossible, terrifying hope. I sang for the girl who used to hide, and I sang for the woman who was refusing to run. I was halfway through the second verse, my eyes closed, lost in the music, when the sound shrieked a deafening blast of feedback that made the crowd recoil. The music stuttered and died. I opened my eyes. Brent Kincaid had burst through the plastic barrier at the side of the stage. He looked like a man who had been pulled from a wreck. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, his face covered in a ragged beard. He wasn't the preening bully from the gym. He was the cornered animal Cyro had described. He lunged and ripped the microphone from my hand, the heavy stand crashing to the plywood. "Eliza!" Delphine's voice was a sharp cry from the front row, but it was drowned out by Brent's distorted roar. "You did this!" he screamed into the mic, his voice echoing across the pier, bouncing off the water. You and your new friend, you took everything from me." The crowd gasped, then murmured. This was New Orleans. They were on the fence, caught between horror and entertainment. Was this part of the show some bizarre piece of performance art about the very abuse we were protesting? I saw the pieces on the board move. In the deep shadows to my left, Lenny Quell, who had been invisible, detached herself from the scaffolding and began to move, a panther gliding through the darkness. Near the sound van, Armand was already on his phone, his face a grim, pale mask. And then there was Cairo. He didn't rush forward, he didn't yell. He simply stood, an immovable object, his stillness a stark contrast to Brent's frantic energy. He locked eyes with me. There was no panic in his gaze, no fear, just a cold, powerful calm. He was an anchor, holding me steady from 50 feet away. The girl who had flinched in the alley was gone. This man was not my problem to solve, but he was on my stage. I took a step toward him, deliberately moving into the center of the harsh white spotlight. "Brent, stop!" I said. My voice was low, but the microphone was sensitive enough to catch it. "Look around you." I pointed to the Bayou Beacon news camera, its red light glowing like a malevolent eye. "You are being filmed from 4 different angles. Let go of the microphone. Walk away before you destroy the last shred of your life." He laughed, a high, broken sound that bordered on a sob. "My life! You destroyed my life! You think I care about a camera?" He dug into his jacket pocket, his hand shaking violently. He pulled out his phone. "I've got my own camera. Let's show them. Let's show all these good people the real Eliza." He held the phone up, his thumb swiping frantically at the screen. "Here it is. Here's the crazy bitch I had to live with." He stabbed his thumb at the play button. Nothing happened. He hit it again, his face crumbling in confusion. The screen was black. A small file not found error message flashed, illuminated by the stage lights. Lenny's digital ghost, the Trojan horse. His last weapon had just turned to dust in his hand. It was right here," he whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up from the dead phone, his wild eyes finding mine. The confusion vanished, replaced by a final, horrifying wave of pure, animalistic rage. He had truly, finally, lost everything. "You," he growled. I stood my ground. The music was gone. The crowd was gone. The world had shrunk to the few feet of plywood separating me from the man who had defined my life by his violence. "I am done," I said, my voice clear and carrying over the silent pier, apologizing for being alive. The silence that followed was absolute. The audience finally, definitively, understood. This was not a performance. That was when he snapped. The bomb went off. He threw the phone down and lunged, not for the mic, but for me. His hand, the one I knew so well, closed around my bare arm. "You're coming with me," he screamed, his fingers digging into the muscle. "If I go down, you go down." He yanked me toward the edge of the stage. I stumbled, a scream tearing from my throat. I saw Cairo move, a blur of forward motion, his hand going inside his jacket, but he stopped. I saw the superhuman effort it took, the clenching of his jaw. He forced himself to stay put. If he, a Valenti, laid a hand on Brent in front of a news camera, the entire narrative would flip. He would be the villain, the monster. The legal case would be destroyed. He didn't have to. A black shape exploded from the shadows at the edge of the stage. Lenny. She moved with an impossible, silent speed. She didn't punch him. She didn't use a weapon. She was a master of physics. She ran low, striking the side of his knee, destabilizing his base. As he buckled, she used his own forward-pulling momentum against him, hooking an arm around his neck and pivoting. It was a clean, brutal, and completely silent takedown. His grip on my arm was broken, and he hit the stage with a sickening thud, the air driven from his lungs in a single, desperate gasp. It was over in a second. And then, it wasn't, "Well, look what we got here." The voice was new. It was cold, amused, and it came from the darkness at the side of the pier, from the gangway leading up from the water. 3 men. They were not Brent's disorganized friends. They were hard, dressed in Marrow Street colors, and they had come here for a different reason. They had been waiting for Brent at the Esplanade cold storage. When he didn't show, they had come to the next logical place. They saw Brent on the ground, Lenny standing over him, and me, the prize. Lenny didn't hesitate. She didn't engage them. Her priority was not the fight, it was me. She shoved me, hard, toward the back of the stage, into the darkness behind the drum riser. "Van now," she screamed, the first time I'd ever heard her raise her voice. At the exact same instant, from the back of the pier, Cairo gave his signal. It wasn't a shout, it was a click. Whump! The entire pier was suddenly, violently, illuminated. Massive floodlights, the kind used in construction, snapped on from the scaffolding, bathing every corner in a harsh, shadow-killing white light. The night was gone, vaporized. The 3 Marrow Street men froze, hands halfway inside their jackets, blinded and exposed. The Bayou Beacon camera, its operator acting on pure instinct, swung around and captured them in perfect high definition. Sirens. They weren't distant, they were here, at the pier entrance. 2 patrol cars from O'Connell's Lakefront Prosecutors Task Force and a van from the non-corrupt unit of the South Shore Anti-Mob Commission swarmed the entrance. They hadn't been coming for the show. They had been staged and waiting, tipped off by Armand that a public disturbance involving known criminals was highly likely. It was a perfect trap. Checkmate. The stage flooded with uniformed officers, the Marrow Street crew, caught in the open, armed, at a public event, put their hands up. And then there was Brent. He was still on his knees, gasping for air. An officer hauled him to his feet, yanking his arms behind his back, the click of the handcuffs loud in the sudden silence. It was over, for real this time. Brent looked past the cops, past the blinding lights, his eyes finding me as I stepped out from behind the drum kit. The rage was gone. The panic was gone. All that was left was a deep, bottomless, and profound confusion. He looked at the officers, at the bright white lights, at the news cameras recording his shame. He had come here for a final, dark confrontation. He had expected an alley fight, the kind of brutal, physical conflict he understood. He had expected Cairo to send silent men in a black SUV. Instead, he had been dismantled by a microphone, a financial ledger, a jammed signal, and a wall of light. He hadn't been taken care of by the darkness. He had been executed by the spotlight. He just stared at me, bewildered, as they pushed him toward the car. A problem, finally, and publicly, solved. The red and blue lights painted the pier in frantic, strobing flashes, turning the scene into a surreal nightmare. Police officers were moving with a grim efficiency, securing the 3 Marrow Street men, their hands cuffed behind their backs, their faces sullen and shocked at having been caught in such a perfect, illuminated trap. I watched as 2 other officers pulled Brent to his feet. He was done fighting. The raw, animalistic rage had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, bewildered shell. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a long, violent dream and didn't know what city he was in. The crowd was silent, 1,000 cell phones held aloft, recording the aftermath. The music had stopped, and the only sound was the crackle of police radios and the distant hum of the city. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the heavy, vintage microphone. Then, Delphine. She ascended the stage steps, her face a mask of iron and indignation. She walked not to me, but to the microphone stand Brent had knocked over. She righted it, her movements calm and deliberate, and tapped the grill. It was still live. "Well," she said, her voice booming across the suddenly silent pier. A few nervous laughs answered her. "That wasn't on our set list, but I'd like to thank the Lakefront Prosecutor's Office for their dramatic participation." She looked out at the sea of faces, her spine as straight and strong as the mast of a ship. "We are here tonight to raise money for people who have survived what you just saw. We are here to say that this city, our music, and our spirit do not bow. We don't bow to threats. We don't bow to violence. And we sure as hell—" She paused, her voice dropping. "Do not stop the music just because some fool tried to break a string." She turned to me, her eyes shining with a fierce, protective fire. "Eliza Voss is going to finish her set." The applause was a roar. It wasn't just clapping, it was a defiant, communal shout. It washed over me, a physical wave of support. I looked at my bandmates, who were staring at me, their instruments held at the ready. I nodded, my hands were still shaking, but it didn't matter. I looked out into the darkness, to the edge of the light where Cairo stood. He hadn't moved. He hadn't rushed the stage to play the hero. He hadn't inserted himself into my frame. He was guarding the perimeter, giving me the stage, letting me be the one to finish this. He saw me looking, and he dipped his head. A single, brief gesture of profound respect. Finish it. I took a deep, shuddering breath and turned to the trumpet player. "St. James Infirmary," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He understood. He raised his horn, and that long, lonely, silver note cut through the air once more. But it wasn't a warning this time. It was a eulogy. I sang. My voice was thick with tears I hadn't shed, full of breath and smoke and the sudden, aching release of a 5-year-long tension. I wasn't performing. I was testifying. I was laying a ghost to rest, right there on the plywood stage, under the glare of the news cameras. I sang for the girl who used to hide her bruises, the one who lived in terror of a ringing phone, the one who had apologized for existing. This song was her funeral. When the last note faded into the damp river air, I didn't wait for the applause. I placed the microphone gently in its stand, turned, and walked away from the light. I didn't follow Lenny's escape route to the van. I went to him. I pushed through the gap in the scaffolding and stepped into the darkness backstage. He met me halfway. I didn't say a word. I just fell into him, my arms locking around his neck, my face pressing into the shoulder of his suit. I clung to him, and his arms wrapped around me, a steel band holding me upright, grounding me. It wasn't a gentle, comforting hug. It was an anchor. It was the desperate, gasping relief of a drowning person finally finding solid land. I felt a knot I had been carrying in my chest for years, a tight, cold ball of fear and shame. Finally, painfully, break apart. I sobbed into his jacket, raw, ugly sounds of pure release. He just held me, his hand stroking the back of my head, his voice a low rumble in my ear, whispering something in Italian. I didn't know the words, but I understood their meaning perfectly. You're safe. It's over. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, until my ragged breaths began to slow and my tears started to mix with a strange, watery, hysterical laughter. "It's done, Eliza," he whispered, his voice thick. "It's finished." "Not quite," a dry voice said from the shadows. We pulled apart, though Cairo kept an arm locked around my waist, steadying me. Armand Bell stood there, illuminated by the glow of his cell phone. For the first time since I'd met him, the lawyer was smiling. It was a thin, sharp, deeply satisfied smile. "That was Prosecutor O'Connell," Armand said. "It seems Mr. Kincaid, faced with a felony extortion charge, public coercion, and the undivided attention of the law, has had a profound moment of clarity. He has accepted the witness protection deal." "He's talking," I whispered, wiping my face. "He's composing an opera," Armand said with relish. "He's giving them everything. The original encrypted phone, which he'd apparently hidden, a full confession of his work for Marrow Street, and most importantly, a detailed statement against Detective Miller at T-Pit. He'll be on a federal plane to a holding facility before sunrise. He's gone. Eliza." "And the Marrow Street crew?" Cairo asked. "Fractured," Armand said, closing his phone. "The 3 gentlemen arrested tonight were their primary enforcers, caught armed, on camera. At a high-profile charity event, the DA is overjoyed. Detective Miller was suspended 30 minutes ago, pending a formal investigation. The Bayou Beacon already has the story. The T-Pit is being internally cleansed as we speak. The house is clean. And Miss Voss..." He looked at me, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "You are, in the eyes of the law and the city, completely free. A free woman." The words hung in the air. Unreal. The ride back to my loft was a quiet, dreamlike blur. A soft rain had begun to fall, washing the sweat and the tension from the air. Lenny drove, her eyes occasionally meeting mine in the rearview mirror. She was smiling, too, a real, small smile. Cairo sat in the back with me, his hand holding mine. Our fingers laced together on the seat. We didn't speak. We just watched the city slide by, the streets slick and shining. He walked me up the stairs to my apartment. I fumbled with my key, my hands still shaking, but from exhaustion now, not fear. I pushed the door open into the dark, familiar space. "Come in," I said. It wasn't a question or an invitation. It was a statement. He followed me inside, closing the door, the sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoing in the quiet room. I didn't turn on the lights. I just went to the window, watching the rain mist over the dark expanse of the river. "You should sleep," he said from behind me. "I don't think I can." I turned to face him. He was a tall shadow against the door. "Stay." He was silent for a long moment. Then he moved across the room, his footsteps as quiet as they had been on the first night. He stopped in front of me, his presence a solid, warm wall. There was no desperation, no frantic need. The intense, heated moment on the balcony felt like a lifetime ago. This was something else. This was the calm after the storm, the deep, slow pull of a tide that has finally turned. I reached up and laid my hand on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart. It was the calmest thing I had ever felt. He covered my hand with his own, his skin warm. We just stood there, breathing each other's air, learning the new silence, the one that wasn't laced with fear. My fingers moved slowly from his chest to the top button of his shirt. I looked up, meeting his eyes in the dim light, a clear, silent question. He held my gaze, his expression unreadable but intense. He gave a single, slow nod. My fingers, clumsy and shaking slightly, fumbled with the button. A small, soft laugh escaped him. He caught my hand, turned it over, and pressed his lips to the pulse point on my wrist, the same wrist that had been bandaged for so long. Then, his hands went to the zipper at the back of my dress. He didn't pull it. His fingers just rested there, a warm weight on my skin, waiting. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back slightly, a silent yes. The slide of the zipper was the only sound in the room. The dress, my armor for the night, pulled at my feet. We moved slowly, as if unstringing a precious instrument, each piece of clothing removed with a shared look, a pause, a silent question and a nodded answer. There was no shame, no awkwardness, just this profound, grounding sense of safety. He led me to the bed. We lay down on top of the covers, side by side, the cool, rain-washed air from the open window settling over us. He turned to face me, propped up on one elbow, and just looked at me. His eyes traced my face in the moonlight, as if he were memorizing every line. His hand, calloused and warm, came up to cup my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, wiping away a tear I hadn't known had fallen. He lowered his hand, letting it slide down my neck, over my shoulder to the small of my back. He splayed his fingers there, a touch that was possessive and yet impossibly respectful. "Okay," he whispered, his voice rough. I met his gaze, my heart full to bursting. "Yes," I breathed. He pulled me closer, until my front was pressed against his, skin to skin. He didn't kiss me, not yet. He just wrapped his arms around me and held me. We lay there, our breathing sinking, his chest rising and falling against mine. It was more intimate than any act, more healing than any words. It was the feeling of a long, cold war finally being over. I woke to the feeling of sunlight on my face. The morning light was streaming through the tall, dusty windows. For a split second, I felt the old, familiar jolt of panic. Where was I? What had happened? Then I felt the heat and the weight. Cairo's arm was draped protectively over my waist, his hand resting on my hip. He was fast asleep, his breathing a deep, even rhythm against my back. I smiled, a real, slow, easy smile. I slipped out of his hold, my movements careful, and padded to the kitchen. I was running water into the coffee maker when his voice, gravelly with sleep, startled me. "That's against the rules, you know." I turned. He was leaning against the doorframe, wearing only his trousers from last night. His hair was a mess, and in the bright morning light, he looked unguarded and younger than I'd ever seen him. "What rule?" I asked, grabbing 2 mugs. "The rule that says you're supposed to stay in bed and let me wake up first." "I need coffee before I can even think about rules," I said, handing him a mug. Our fingers brushed, sending a small, warm spark up my arm. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving mine. "What's in the bag?" he asked, nodding to the counter. "An emergency," I said, pulling out a white paper bag from Café du Monde left over from our breakfast. "I believe in being prepared." He raised an eyebrow. "You have emergency beignets." "This is New Orleans," I said, opening the bag. A cloud of powdered sugar poofed into the air. "Everyone should have emergency beignets." I took one out and took a bite, showering the front of my t-shirt with sugar. He laughed, that rare, genuine sound I was beginning to crave. He took one for himself, and we stood there in my sun-drenched loft, drinking black coffee and eating stale, perfect beignets. He got a smudge of sugar on his nose. I reached up, my hand steady, and wiped it away with my thumb. He caught my hand before I could pull it back and pressed a kiss into my palm. It was quiet. There was no grand declaration, no promise of forever. There was just this, the conscious, deliberate choice to stand together in the sunlight, covered in sugar, and be perfectly, ridiculously, peacefully happy. It was the most normal and the most revolutionary thing I had ever done. The morning piece was a thin sheet of ice, and it cracked the moment I stepped outside my building. Sprayed across the old brick wall opposite my door, in crude, angry red letters, was the phrase, "Valente's marionette." The words were a brand, a public shaming. They weren't just attacking Cairo, they were trying to erase me, to reduce my entire ordeal to a staged play where I was nothing but a puppet. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to a new, uglier battlefield, my story. The second attack came an hour later, delivered silently to my inbox. The sender was anonymous, the subject line blank. Inside was a link to a heavily edited video clip. It was a grotesque collage snippets of the grainy footage Brent had, spliced with out-of-context shots of me laughing with customers at the club, and ending with a photo of Cairo leaving my apartment building in the early morning light. A title card was added at the end, the real Eliza Voss, from victim to Valente's whore. The email text was short: the Gulf Coast Arts Fellowship values integrity. It would be a shame if this made its way to their board of directors and to the press. Withdraw your application, now. My blood ran cold. This was more insidious than a fist or a threat in an alley. This was an attempt to poison my future, to use my own image to destroy the life I was just beginning to build. When I showed the email to Ciro, in the quiet of Armand's office, I saw a look in his eyes I hadn't seen before. It was a cold, quiet, final fury. It was the look of a man whose patience had been utterly exhausted. "Armand," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Cancel my afternoon. Lenny and I are going to pay a visit to the Marrow Street Social Club. We're going to pull this problem out by the roots." He was going to burn them down, the old way, with fists and fear. He was going to meet their darkness with a greater darkness. And in that moment, I knew that if I let him, some part of the man I had come to know would be lost in that fire. "No," I said. Both men turned to look at me. I put my hand on Ciro's arm. It was tense, coiled like a steel spring. "No," I said again, my voice quiet but unwavering. "We fought them on the pier with light. We beat them in the courtroom with paper. We don't go back into the shadows now. Not when we're this close to the sun." I looked him in the eye. "Use the light one more time, Cairo. Let's show them we're not afraid of what they'll find." He stared at me, a war raging behind his eyes, the old instincts versus this new, unfamiliar strategy. Finally, I saw the tension in his shoulders ease, the fury in his eyes replaced by a slow, dawning respect. He nodded, a single sharp motion. He was ceding the field to me. He was trusting my way. The plan we devised was audacious, a final, magnificent act of defiance. We would take their chosen dungeon, the place where they had tried to bait me, and we would turn it into our stage. We would hold a live recorded performance at the Esplanade Cold Storage. Armand sent out the invitations, not just to the press, but to the board of the Gulf Coast Arts Fellowship, to Prosecutor O'Connell from the Lakefront office, to our trusted contacts at the Bayou Financial Crimes Directorate and the newly cleansed South Shore Anti-Mob Commission. The event was billed as an exclusive live recording session, the debut of Eliza Voss. It wasn't just a concert. It was a public deposition disguised as a work of art. Lenny transformed the cavernous, refrigerated warehouse into a stark, minimalist theater. There were no decorations, no velvet curtains. There was only a single, round platform in the center of the vast concrete floor, lit by a battery of harsh, white, shadowless film lights. A single microphone stood in the center. The cameras were placed around the perimeter, their lenses exposed, capturing every angle. There would be no dark corners for anyone to hide in. The night of the performance, the air inside the warehouse was frigid, my breath pluming in front of me in white clouds. The invited guests, bundled in coats, sat on simple wooden chairs, their faces a mixture of confusion and anticipation. As I was about to go on, a disturbance broke out near the loading bay doors. A half-dozen Marrow Street thugs, sent to disrupt, to intimidate, tried to push their way inside. They were met not by Cairo's men, but by a calm, professional team of uniformed city security guards, hired by Armand, who checked their names against a list and politely, but firmly, denied them entry. All of it was captured in the clear, unforgiving view of a Bayou Beacon news camera. The first attack was neutralized before it had even begun. I walked out onto the platform. The white light was so bright it felt solid. The cold from the concrete floor seeped through the soles of my shoes. I was freezing. I was terrified, and I had never felt more powerful. I took the microphone. the cold metal a familiar weight in my hand, and nodded to the sound engineer. The simple, clean notes of a piano filled the cavernous space. I took a breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and I sang, "No More Closed Doors." I had finished it that afternoon. The lyrics told the whole story, the sound of a fist hitting a wall, the silence of an unanswered phone, the moment a stranger steadies a tray, the choice to walk into the light instead of running for the shadows. I sang for myself, for Cairo's mother, for every person who had ever been told to be quiet. As I sang the final, soaring chorus, a massive projection screen behind me flickered to life. It showed a live video feed. The image was of a man in shadow, his face blurred, his voice digitally altered to a low, robotic monotone. It was Brent. He wasn't speaking to me or to the crowd. He was speaking to Prosecutor O'Connell, who was patched in remotely. His voice, stripped of all its bluster, was the final devastating piece of evidence. "Yes, they told me to threaten her," the robotic voice said. "Marrow Street. They wanted to use the girl, Eliza, to get at Valente. They threatened to burn down the club, the Blue Magnolia, if she talked to the cops." A new image appeared on screen, a copy of the threatening photo and matches that had been sent to Delphine. "And yes," Brent's voice continued, "Detective Miller at T-Pit was the one who gave us the heads up about the raids. He was on their payroll. He told us exactly when and where to not be." The final nail, a full confession, delivered from the safety of witness protection, confirming every piece of our puzzle. The song ended, the video feed cut out, the warehouse was utterly silent. Armand Bell stepped into the light, holding a tablet. "What you have just heard," he said, his calm academic voice echoing in the cold, "is the testimony of a cooperating federal witness. It corroborates the evidence we are now submitting to the district attorney and the press." On the screen, documents appeared: offshore financial records, laundered money trails, copies of anonymous threatening emails, all tracing a clean, undeniable line back to the Marrow Street crew. The war for the waterfront is over. Not a single shot was fired. I looked over at Cairo, and he was standing near the edge of the light next to Delphine, and I saw it on his face, the unarmoring, the profound, bone-deep relief of a man who had spent his entire life solving problems with force, who had just watched the biggest threat to his world be dismantled, piece by piece, by the very things he had never trusted: the law, the truth, and a song. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not just love, but a kind of awe. He was free, too. In the stunned silence, a woman from the front row walked onto the stage. It was the director of the Gulf Coast Arts Fellowship. She was holding a large, formal envelope. "Miss Voss," she said, her voice ringing with emotion, "on behalf of the board, who have just witnessed one of the bravest performances I have ever seen, your application has been accepted." She handed me the envelope. Tucked into the flap was a small, handwritten note. It said, "For a voice with spine." Delphine was the first one to reach me, her arms wrapping around me in a fierce, proud hug. I saw Lenny in the crowd, and she gave me a single, crisp thumbs up. Even Armand was smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face. The night ended where our story had truly begun, on the small, wrought-iron balcony of the Blue Magnolia. A soft, cleansing rain was falling, muffling the sounds of the city. We stood close, not touching, just watching the raindrops beat on the railing. "Court dates and concert dates," I said softly, a smile playing on my lips. "It's going to be a complicated future." "The best ones always are," he said. He finally turned to me, his hands finding my waist, drawing me close. He kissed me, a slow, gentle kiss that tasted of rain and relief and the promise of 1,000 ordinary mornings. "I'll learn when to let go of power," he whispered against my lips. "And you just keep singing." And so the knots were untied. In the weeks that followed, the Marrow Street crew was systematically prosecuted, their empire of fear crumbling under the weight of Armand's paper wall. The T-Pit was purged, its corruption exposed to the light, and Brent Kincaid was taken care of, in the truest sense of the word, protected by the law, and held accountable by it, sentenced for his own crimes after his testimony was complete, and I, Eliza Voss, stood in the center of it all, my voice ringing out from the stage, no longer a puppet, no longer a victim, but the master of my own story. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're curious. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let us know in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Mafia Boss Stories. Give this video a like and show your support by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.